Yeah, so again, thank you very much for this invitation. And it's such a pity I can't be there in person. That would have been a much easier option with respect to the presentation. Yeah, so let me just then start again. Yeah, so the talk will be about a kind of overview of the role of tropes in the semantics of natural language and in metaphysics. And so to an extent, I will go through my own older work on tropes. And then also I have a number of additions to make. Yeah, so tropes, the term trope is a fairly recent one. It was introduced by Donald Williams in an important article of 1953. And there are other terms that philosophers have used, because the term trope is, of course, also used for something in rhetoric. So particularized property, property instance, abstract particular are other terms for tropes. And then, as I mentioned yesterday, there is also, in fact, a much older tradition preceding, like going back to antiquity, where the concept of a trope played an important role. And in fact, that goes back to Aristotle. So Aristotle used the notion of an accident, and then medieval philosophers and other philosophers subsequently also used the term mode. And so in a way, the two traditions talked about the same sort of thing, but with actually quite different interests, and I'll come to that. Yeah, so let me first talk about the notion of a trope in general. So tropes have so a trope, for example, is John's happiness or Socrates' wisdom or the whiteness of the wall. So to just give some examples, so there are particular properties. There are properties like the happiness as instantiated in John. So they're fully specific, they're concrete, and as such, they play particular roles. One second. Sorry, one can distinguish, first of all, three different kinds of tropes. First, we have qualitative tropes, like the wisdom of Socrates, the happiness of John, the originality of the book, the elegance of the dress. So here you have like qualitative properties as instantiated in particular individuals. Then we have quantitative tropes. So that was a notion that was introduced already by Campbell in 1990, and then I made use of it in various places. So like the weight of the book is not just like an abstract degree, but rather it's a particular feature of the book, namely sort of the book reduced to how much it weighs. And similarly, the number of planets, I have argued, doesn't refer to a number as an abstract object, but rather it refers to sort of the plurality of the planets with respect to just how much they are. And so for the height of the building and the temperature in the room. And then finally, in my own older work, I argued that there are tropes that have variable objects as bearers. So like the book John wants to write, that doesn't refer to a specific book, but sort of it refers to all the possible books in situations that satisfy John's desire. And that constitutes a sort of variable object. And then the originality of the book John wants to write, one can say, refers to a particular feature of such a variable object that has manifestations as different books in different situations of the satisfaction of John's desire. And similarly for the number of people that fit into the bus. So it doesn't refer to a feature of a particular group of people, but rather it refers to a feature of like possible groups of people that fit into the bus, or that fit into the car, sorry. And they, in some sense, constitute a variable object, so which is associated with the function from circumstances to pluralities of people that fit into the car in those circumstances. So these are three kinds of tropes one can distinguish. And then what are the important properties of tropes? So unlike properties as universals, tropes depend ontologically on their bearer. So Socrates' wisdom depends on Socrates. And now there are two notions of ontological dependence, and they are both to an extent exhibited by tropes. So first there's existence dependent. So Socrates' wisdom exists only in a world in which Socrates exists. So a trope exists only if the bearer exists on which it depends. And then two tropes are identical only if their bearers are identical. So the wisdom of A and the wisdom of B implies that A and B are identical. Now, one may think that there also needs to be a unique bearer per trope. And that's a common assumption that's made in the literature. However, that doesn't seem to be right. And that's something I argued for in a particular article of 2013 on relative identity, so apparent segments of identity. So if we take a statue that's made of brown clay, one can refer to the brownness of the statue, and one can refer to the brownness of the clay. And now the brownness of the statue is really not distinct from the brownness of the clay, even if you think that the statue is really distinct from the clay. But the brownness of the statue is the very same feature as the brownness of the clay. So there's no point of distinguishing these two tropes. So that's an interesting observation to be made that is not always held. Then another important relation concerning tropes is similarity relations. So generally it is held that tropes instantiating the same property are similar. And now tropes instantiating the same natural property, like a specific shade of a hue of red, are exactly similar. So if you have tropes like the redness of the spokes, the redness of that head, the two rednesses may not be exactly similar because one may be crimson and the other one may be more pink. But if the two tropes instantiate the very same shade and hue of a degree of redness, then they will be exactly similar. So they need to instantiate the same natural property. And now in natural language, we see sameness of similarity of tropes very well manifested, namely in the applicability of the same as. The quality of this fabric is the same as the quality of that fabric. So the same as here conveys similarity or strong similarity. And now if you would say the quality of this fabric is the quality of that fabric, that doesn't seem to be right. Why? Because here you use is of identity, and that's not the is the same as of similarity or exact similarity. And also, like in the case of the number trope, if you say the number of women is the same as the number of men, that's perfectly fine. It means there are as many women as men. So the two number tropes are identical, exactly similar. But if you were to say the number of women is the number of men, that doesn't sound right. And that's because one number trope with the women as bearer cannot be identical with another number trope with a man as bearer. So we see tropes being really well reflected in natural language in these trope-preferring noun phrases, and then in the applicability of is the same as opposed to is. Now, in addition, tropes are taken to display standard properties of concreteness. So they are generally viewed as, or a number of philosophers have considered tropes as objects of perception, in fact, as the immediate objects of perception. And that was one of the motivations for tropes in this more recent tradition of Williams and then also Campbell and Lowe. So we can say things like 6A, B, and C, where we seem to have tropes acting as objects of perception. And then tropes have been viewed as relata of causal relations, also by Williams. And there seems to be evidence for that in natural language, in the examples in 7A, B, and C. And then in this more recent tradition initiated by Williams, tropes are taken to come with a spatial temporal location. Now, the spatial location seems to be unproblematic. So one can say John's happiness lasted only a year, namely that particular year or so. That's fine. But now if John has always lived in Munich and never left Munich, and he was always happy, you couldn't really say John's happiness was in Munich, even if John was always in Munich. Or if the vase is on the table and the vase is heavy, you somehow couldn't say the heaviness of the vase is on the table. So locating a trope where the bearer is located doesn't seem to be natural at all, unlike what the philosophers, at least in the more recent tradition about tropes, have said. One second. Yeah, so let me just briefly talk about the two traditions, because I think I actually skipped a page. So I'm really sorry. So now we are on page 2. Yeah, so we first had the roles of tropes in metaphysics, and now concerning the two traditions. So here I say a little bit more about the two traditions. So first we have the Aristotelian tradition, which takes tropes to be one category among other ontological categories, namely 3 other ontological categories, at least in Aristotle. So Aristotle distinguishes substances or individuals from secondary substances, like of Socrates, and then like being a man as a universal. And then we also have accidents or modes or tropes, and a corresponding universal of qualities, not quantities, sorry, on the handout. So here we can say we have individuals and the corresponding universal, and then also tropes and the corresponding universal, namely qualities. So here tropes just play a role as a separate category beside individuals. And then in this more recent tradition initiated by Williams in 1953, there was this interest in reducing all ontological categories to tropes. So tropes are then the only fundamental category, and individuals have been viewed as bundles of co-located tropes. And then properties or universals have been viewed as classes of exactly similar tropes. Now, for the second view, there seems to be like a good motivation from natural language in that tropes that are exactly similar, so of which we can apply is the same as, naturally instantiate the same property. So it's actually fairly natural to then form a similarity class of tropes that corresponds to a property. I think it's quite natural to, in fact, view a trope like redness, let's say, as just a class of similar tropes, or a plurality of similar tropes. Now, concerning the first view in this recent tradition on which individuals are bundles of co-located tropes, here we see that a crucial assumption is made about tropes, which we just notice is in fact problematic, namely that tropes come with a special temporal location. If tropes do not come with a spatial temporal location, this first assumption wouldn't make sense. So individuals as bundles of co-located tropes. So that presupposes that tropes come with a spatial temporal location. Now, we have actually seen that while tropes may naturally be located in time, they are they don't seem to have a direct location in space. So they, in fact, they do not even seem to have to inherit their location from their bearer. So it's actually not particularly good to locate tropes in space, but rather you can do it only indirectly by locating the bearer, but not the trope itself. So the first assumption of this recent tradition is actually quite problematic. Now, yesterday I was able to mention there are two views of universals which are reflected differently in natural language. So we have a way of referring to a universal of wisdom as wisdom, a bare adjective nominalization, and we can refer to it as the property of being wise or the property of wisdom. And the first term seems to reflect well this kind of Aristotelian notion of a universal that's inherent in objects, that exists only if an instance exists. So wisdom exists basically means there is an instance of wisdom. So we can see this Aristotelian view extremely well reflected in this the semantics behavior of this particular kind of term. And we also predicate properties of wisdom on the basis of their instances only. So we can say, I encountered wisdom, meaning, of course, I encountered an instance of wisdom. It can't possibly mean that I countered in some Platonic heaven an abstract object. It can really not mean that. And then we can predicate distributive properties like widespread of wisdom, and we do that on the basis of this. Now, if I say I encountered the property of being wise, that doesn't make sense unless you're talking about some metaphysical fantasy. So the property of being wise seems to reflect a kind of Platonic universal, which doesn't inherit properties from its instances and can exist independently of whether it's instantiated. So the property of being wise exists whether or not there are instances of wisdom. And you couldn't easily say the property of being wise is widespread. That doesn't really sound very good. And that's because that kind of universal doesn't inherit its properties from its instance. Or yeah. So it seems in natural language, there are two kinds of categories of universals, one of which is really an inherent universal, which one arguably which arguably is conceivable as just a kind of trope. So in fact, in my book of 2013, I argued that wisdom is nothing but the plurality of actual and possible tropes of wisdom. And in contrast to that, terms like the property of being wise stand for really abstract objects, which arguably are obtained by reification from concepts or whatever is conveyed by a predicate, or if you like, from a predicate itself, if you like follow a view of something from nothing, transformations like Schiffer did. So there are two very different ways to talk about universal in natural language, and in fact they correspond arguably to two different ontological notions of a universal, one of which is an Aristotelian notion, which may be spelled out in terms of a plurality of actual and possible tropes, and the other one is a kind of Platonic notion, which is a notion of a universal that exists independently of its instances and doesn't get its properties from its instances, but rather from maybe the logical semantic behavior of the corresponding predicate or concept. Yeah, so this was what was missing in the talk before. Now we go back to page 4. So the various properties of concreteness. So there's another property of concreteness of tropes, which is a property of concreteness that is often ignored in the literature. In fact, I think beside my own article of 2007 where I introduced this criterion. In general, it's not mentioned among criteria of concreteness. So that criterion is a kind of description independence. And in the case of tropes, it means tropes generally have an internal structure or quality that goes below the description that's used to refer to them. So what does this mean? So if you take, for example, Mary's beauty. So Mary's beauty is a trope that involves a very particular way in which Mary is beautiful, which may be quite different from the way Sue is beautiful. And now you can say John described Mary's beauty in all detail, but you couldn't possibly, and so describe, the predicate describe is applicable to a trope, but you couldn't possibly say John described Mary's being beautiful, where Mary's being beautiful is just the state of Mary's being beautiful, or the state of affairs, or maybe a fact. But these are completely different things from tropes. So states are strictly dependent on the content of the state referring term. They are really abstractions from like the content of the make up a description, a state referring term, like being beautiful and Mary. And so states are not fully specific. By contrast, tropes are fully specific. So that's really what we see in natural language. And then one can also compare tropes, like John may compare Mary's beauty to Sue's beauty, but he couldn't possibly compare Mary's being beautiful to there's not much to state one fact and state another fact, but there's not much else to do because they are just the obtaining of a property of an object. And then related to that is the possibility that tropes have, for tropes to have a measurable extent. By contrast, facts and states on states of affairs do not come with that. So we see that again very well in natural language. So we can say Mary's happiness exceeds Bill's happiness. So happiness is something one can sort of measure in extent, but one couldn't possibly say the fact that Mary likes Bill exceeds the fact that Mary is tall or something like that, or the state of Mary's liking Bill exceeds the state of Mary's being tall. So exceed doesn't apply to facts or states of affairs, but tropes, it applies to tropes, and that indicates that tropes come with a measurable extent, which again means that tropes are fully specific. They go below in their specificity with the content of the description that's being used to refer to the trope. And now tropes to an extent obtain properties from their bearer when one focuses on particular features of their bearer. And that again is something we can see very well in natural language. So one can say John exceeds and then add in eagerness. And that allows you then to say John's eagerness exceeds Mary's eagerness. And that here we have a contrast with properties. So the property of being very eager exceeds the property of being not so eager. It's actually not particularly good. So this exceed here, this exceed relation is applicable to tropes in a way that was actually already reflected in its applicability to the bearers. But when we talk about properties, we don't see this connection to the applicability of a predicate to their bearers. And we again can see the behavior of number tropes in that respect as well. So one can say the men exceed the women in number. And then we can say the number of men exceeds the number of women. So it's no accident that we can have these two sentences that are that involve the same predicate exceed, but we couldn't say the number 13, even if that was, if 13 was the, like, if the main number 13, so we can't say the number 13 exceeds the number 8, assuming that there were 8 women. So if you have 13 men and 8 women, we can say the number of men exceeds the number of women, but we couldn't say the number 13 exceeds or is greater than, exceeds the number 8. And again, that shows that we really have number trope, number of men, rather than reference to abstract objects. Okay, so tropes play a very important role in certain noun phrases, which may involve adjective nominalizations as had. Now, this raises the question, well, what is the role of tropes in adjectives when they're used predicatively? So like in 16a, we have John is enormously wealthy. So here we have an adjective as predicate, wealthy, but we also have a modifier of an adjective, enormously. And now what we can observe is that there is an alternation of between 16a and 16b. So 16a corresponds to 16b, is equivalent to it. So John is enormously wealthy is the same as saying John's wealth is enormous. So it seems the modifier of the adjective can also then generally be used as the predicate of the corresponding adjective nominalization, which refer to a trope. So John's wealth refers to a quantitative trope, and it allows for what was the modifier of the adjective to now act as a predicate. And similarly, Mary is highly intelligent corresponds to Mary's intelligence is high. So highly seems to act as a predicate of a trope in both 17a and 17b. And that now should somehow be reflected in the semantics of adjectives. Now, how do we do that? So there are two options. One of them is to pursue a kind of Davidsonian analysis of adjectives, on which adjectives denote two-place relations between tropes and bearers. So intelligent will denote a two-place relation between a trope and a bearer. John is highly intelligent will have the logical form in 18b. So there's a trope T, which stands in the intelligent relation to John. And then the modifier of the adjective highly can now be viewed just as a predicate high of a trope. And so when you have John's intelligence is high, you use the very same predicate high applied to a trope, which is then denoted by John's intelligence. So this would be a Davidsonian analysis, which takes tropes to be kind of implicit arguments of adjectives, and adjectives will also have an argument position for the bearer. Now, one may also pursue a neo-Davidsonian analysis of adjectives. Now, the neo-Davidsonian analysis of verbs says that a verb is just a one-place predicate of an event. So when you have a verb like to butter, in Davidson's famous example, John buttered the toast at midnight. So on Davidson's analysis, butter is denotes a three-place relation between events of buttering and then agents like John, and then objects like the toast. On the neo-Davidsonian analysis, butter just is a predicate of events, and then thematic relation ensure that that event is connected to John as an agent and to the toast as the theme. Now, it is natural to then pursue a neo-Davidsonian analysis of adjectives on which adjectives are just one-place predicates of tropes. So intelligent would be a one-place predicate of a trope. and then high again is a predicate of that trope. And then you have to connect that trope to its bearer and make appeal to a kind of thematic relation of bearerhood. So this is what one would naturally say for, in fact, the same reason as one had, as semanticists had pursued a neo-Davidsonian analysis of verbs. But as a matter of fact, for tropes that has not really been made explicit in the literature, this kind of neo-Davidsonian analysis of adjectives as one-place predicates of tropes. But in any case, so semantics based on tropes can naturally be applied to adjectives. So tropes then play an important role in both noun phrases formed with adjective normalizations, or maybe functional expressions like number, and they play then also a central role in the semantics of adjectives. So in a paper of 2013, actually in 2009, I then also pursued semantics of comparatives and degree expressions based on tropes rather than abstract degrees. So in fact, I reconstructed abstract degrees in terms of tropes. And I argued that such an analysis is superior to an analysis that starts out with abstract degrees rather than tropes. So there are very good motivations, it seems, for tropes from the semantics of adjectives and then other sorts of noun phrases that refer, it seems, to tropes like number, noun phrases with the noun number. Now let's come to another place in the semantics of natural language where tropes play a role. And again, this comes from older work of mine of 2013, so the two papers of 2013, A and B, which just to show you that, given here. So it's tropes, bare demonstratives, and apparent statements of identity, and then identificational sentences. So in those papers, I argued that tropes are involved in sentences like, this is Mary. Now, this is Mary is what is called an identificational sentence. And here, the pronoun this is a special pronoun. It's a kind of bare demonstrative. It is what I call the presentational pronoun. So it's a pronoun that occurs across languages. So we have in French, ce, like cela, c'était une femme. So, and in German, for example, we have das ist eine Frau, where crucially we have a neutral pronoun das. And so neutral pronouns in general cannot be used to refer to people. So also the English pronoun this cannot generally be used to refer to people. So I can't say without offending, I saw this yesterday, meaning I saw John yesterday. And I can't say John married this a few years ago, meaning he married Mary a few years ago. So this cannot be used to refer to people, unless you want to offend somebody. So presentational pronouns also are, presentational pronouns, so they are restricted to the subject position of identificational sentences. And as such, they are not ordinary referential noun phrases. So there's a number of evidence, there's various evidence for that. First of all, we cannot have presentational pronouns occurring or coordinated with referential noun phrases. So we can't say Mary and that are a beautiful couple, trying to refer to Bill. And we cannot say Bill or that was the chairman of the session when we wanted to say something like Bill or John was the chairman of the session. Now, ordinary neutral demonstratives can, of course, be used referentially and also in coordination, like about this and the cake pointing at a melon. So this by itself can be used referentially, but in the subject position of a identificational sense, it is special in that it couldn't possibly be coordinated with an ordinary referential noun phrase. And then also it is special in that it's incompatible with so-called ordinary variables in linguistics, so like ordinary relative pronouns. So we can't say that whom I first did not recognize was John. So that here is a presentational pronoun. Whom is an ordinary relative pronoun standing for like an ordinary variable, as linguists would say. And these two things are not compatible. And also like we can't have the like ordinary quantifiers with presentational pronouns in an exception phrase, like everybody except that came to the party, meaning like everybody except Bill, impossible. But ordinary neutral demonstratives allow for that. So everybody except this, everything except this is poison pointing at a cake. Now, the post-copular position of an identificational sentence is, by contrast, kind of referential. It corresponds to an ordinary variable. So one can say, who, what was that? Where that is a presentational pronoun and who is an ordinary interrogative pronoun. So there's an asymmetry. What is also special about identificational sentences is that we can only have an epistemic interpretation of modals. So Mary could be a gymnast, allows for can to could to convey circumstantial modality, physical modality, but this could be a gymnast pointing at Mary. Here we can only have an epistemic interpretation of could. So very clear data that show the distinction between presentational sentences and ordinary modal sentences. Now, in the post-copular position of an identificational sentence, we always need a sortal or proper name. So we can't say that is beautiful pointing at a woman. We have to say something like that is Mary or that is a beautiful woman. So identificational sentences are very special in several respects, and the pronoun in the subject position is also quite special. Now, I argue that the pronoun in identificational sentences, in fact, makes reference to a trope and sometimes an event, and the identificational sentence by itself then serves to identify the bearer of the trope. So like if I say, this is my partner and I point at a person, I refer to sort of the appearance of that person, a trope, what can be perceived immediately. And then the sentence is meant to convey that that person, that appearance has a bearer that is my partner. So this is basically the function of identificational sentences on that view. Now one might think, well, maybe I'm actually making a reference to a universal, and then I say that that universal has an instance. Wouldn't that be an option that can do without reference to tropes? Well, no, that can't be because you cannot have reference with this presentation pronoun to an apparent universal and then possibly point at two different instances. So you may, so let's say you see something flashing in front of you, and you can say, did you see that? And then say that could have been Mary, but that could also, then that was Mary, and that was also Sue. That's impossible, even if you have like just a red flash. So Mary is dressed in a red dress, and also Sue. So they both could have been a bearer of this property of redness in front of you, but you couldn't use identificational sentences in that way. So you can use them only referring to a particular property, but something very specific that comes with a particular bearer. you cannot use it in order to refer to a universal and then identify different bearers of that universal. Like even if that universal like were to be manifested in just a particular perceptual particular. So with that, you refer to that particular. You couldn't refer to the universal that's instantiated by that particular. That is the point. Now, there is a general constraint on identificational sentences in that the subject must make reference to something that is an object of perception. So one can refer to a visual appearance, like in 31A, this is my sister, or in 31B. But one can also refer to an acoustical appearance, like talking on the phone. I can say, this is me. It's a very common way of talking, and it's actually quite puzzling because with this, I cannot generally refer to myself. So like, I like this, referring to myself, impossible. But with this here, you're just going to the perceivable sound of the voice. And now one may think of other circumstances where one could refer to something that whose bearer isn't obvious, like one could point at a house and mean Mary, who is in the house. Now, this is not possible. So here we are referring to an object which doesn't come with a bearer. And that is then not possible to convey with an identificational sentence. So we can't refer to the house and say, this is Mary. So we need to refer to a trope, something that is perceivable and comes with a particular bearer. We can't refer to a dress and say, this is Mary. We can only refer to an appearance and then identify the bearer of that appearance. So what is then the formal semantics of identificational sentences? So the view, first of all, is that the presentational pronoun makes reference to a trope, but it's not really a referential term just referring to a trope, because we can't say something like 33, that feature, where that feature is like a referential trope referring noun phrase. We can't say that feature is Mary. So what we have in sentences is that we have a pronoun that makes reference to a trope, but it's not a referential term. It serves make reference to a trope, but that it conveys a sort of function mapping the trope onto its particular circumstances. So one could then say this in an identificational sentence that refers to the trope that the speaker in the context refers to with its utterance in that context. But then it has an additional presentational denotation on which it in fact denotes the function that makes any conceivable world, epistemically possible world, compatible with what is known in that world, to the sum of entities that according to that world are the bearers of like that trope that was being referred to in that world. And then is makes sure that the entity referred to with the post-copular noun phrase includes the entities that, let's say, the entities referred to with the post-copular noun phrase in an identification sentence include the entities that this, on its presentational denotation, maps the relevant world onto. So when we have this is a beautiful woman, like beautiful woman stands for a plurality of women, let's say, and the identificational sentence makes sure that this conveys, sorry, that the bearer of the trope that this refers to is among like the beautiful women in the relevant world. So this is roughly the way the formal semantics of presentational pronouns in and identificational sentences looks. And so for more details, I refer you to my paper of 2000, my two papers of 2013. So this is sorry, and so on this view, tropes play a role in these identificational sentences, and then in addition, one may say they also play a role in philosophically quite relevant sentences, namely sentences that appeared to convey relative identity. So relative identity statements are statements of the sort like this is the same statue, but not the same piece of clay as that, pointing, let's say, at two photographs of lumps of clay. So this is the same statue, but not the same lump of clay as that. And so we have two photographs of the same statue, but made from somewhat different lumps of clay. And so this would be a typical relative identity statement. But now the fact is that relative identity statements that sound natural characteristically involve this presentational pronoun, this and then that. And when one analyzes this, no longer identity, a statement that is an identificational sentence involving the identification of bearers of two tropes as of like, and then attributing sortals to those bearers. And now recall from the beginning that I argued that I pointed out that tropes need not have a unique bearer. So here we have the lump of clay and the statue. With this, we refer to like an appearance which has as its bearer both a lump of clay and a statue. And so we can identify two kinds of bearers of this we are referring to with the presentational pronoun, the lump of clay and the statue. And then we attribute to one bearer the same statue as, but not to the other bearer. So we really see this metaphysical tropes being reflected with respect to the analysis of identificational sentences of a particular sort. So this is one application of tropes in another philosophical context. And then another possible application of tropes would be to the metaphysics of relations, in particular Bradley's regress. So this is a problem of how a relation as a universal could hold between two objects without having then to make use of another relation, like relating the one object as an argument to the relation and the other object as another argument to the relation. So how do you connect two objects without now invoking relations, connecting those two objects to the relation? Now, one way of possibly solving the problem is to replace the relation as a universal with like a that particular relational tropes as instances or as consisting of particular relational tropes. So if R is a relational trope, then it is a trope that already depends on two objects as its bearers. And so it already ontologically depends on A and B. So there's no problem of like identifying the objects on which a relation as particular ontologically depends. So there's no issue of connecting A to one argument position and B to another argument position, because the particular relational trope R is already connected to A and B because it ontologically depends on A and B. And so one could say the problem is of Bradley's regress is solved by taking the relation to just be a kind of relational tropes, and connecting two objects by a relation means to take a suitable relational trope, which already in some sense connects A and B. Okay, so this was all for my presentation. And on the handout, you see like quite a few references from my own older work on tropes, where I try to be quite complete, and then references relating to the two traditions regarding tropes, the Aristotelian tradition and the more recent tradition that was initiated by Donald Williams.
Okay, thank you, Friederike, so much for your talk. Now I think we have time for questions. Yeah. So if anyone wants to ask the question, you may do it orally, or you may post the question in a public chat and I will read it. So I see one question is already posted. So if someone wants to ask the question orally, so you may, well, raise your hand. Yeah, so here we have a button at the end of the screen, or you may just turn on your micro and start asking your questions. So do we have any questions? Okay, it seems like we don't have questions for now. So I suggest to start from the question which is already was posted by Ilya. So I will read it. Yeah. And so Ilya, if you want to add something else, you may also post it in the chat. So, okay, Ilya says, my question is about mathematical terms and objects in natural language and in mathematics itself. If we take numbers as an example, we know that numbers have many properties, some of them sophisticated and even strange. They can also be represented in infinitely many ways as sets and so on. This seems quite different from how numbers are used in ordinary natural language by people. So perhaps this is a somewhat radical idea, but could natural language numbers be entirely different objects from numbers as mathematical entities? If not, what is the criterion of identity between, for example, the number 2 in a natural language, and as we use it, and the Zermelo version of that number, where 2 equals an empty set, and I don't know actually how to read it correctly. This formulation like a set of an empty set. Yeah, it's better to say it this way. Okay.
Good, yeah. So I think in natural language we have two different ways to refer to numbers. So one of them is the noun phrase of the sort, the number of men. And the other one is like the number 2. And now I would say the number of men, that's really a construction in the core of natural language. And with that construction, we refer to number tropes. And number tropes have very different properties from numbers as used in mathematics. So they have properties of concreteness. They inherit these measurable properties from their bearers, like to exceed, to be high. These are properties that they seem to, in some sense, inherit from their bearers when we look at the bearers with respect to a particular feature. namely of how many they are. And by contrast, the number 2 has very different properties. Now, I myself think that the number 2 belongs to natural language, but in fact, it belongs to the periphery of natural language. And so mathematicians and philosophers can refer to whatever conception they want to adopt for numbers with terms like the number 2. And mathematicians as well. So they may adopt a particular conception of a number and refer to it with the number 2. And another mathematician may adopt a different conception of numbers. And he is or she is also able to refer to that conception with the number 2. And that's something you can have with expressions in the periphery of natural language. You have this flexibility. You can do conceptual engineering if you like. You're not constrained by natural language in a sense, by the ontology of natural language, but rather you can posit any ontology you like, and you can be successful in referring in the periphery to entities in that ontology. So that's how I would view that issue. So mathematics can to an extent be formulated in terms of natural language, but we are making use of the periphery of natural language. So there's no point of saying, well, mathematicians use natural language in this or that way, therefore what I'm saying is not correct. No, I'm actually talking about the core of natural language, where we have robust intuitions that are reflected in natural language. We have robust generalizations. In the periphery, we do not have robust generalizations. So there's no constraint on like the number 2. It can refer to a Samelo version of that number or something else, whatever one may want to adopt.
Okay, thank you, Friederike. So, yeah, I wanted to ask Ilya, does it answer his question? Yeah, he says okay, and he says thank you. Okay, so anyone else? Well, while people are thinking about their questions, I may use this time to ask my questions for you. So I have some of them. So my first question is connected to the point from a part in your presentation. I think it was a part about different types of tropes, like at the beginning of your presentation. So I might even find it. So it was a part 1.3, examples of tropes and of trope referring terms. I wanted to ask you about such thing as a generic objects. Can we say that we reduce tropes with generic objects as barriers to one of these 3 categories, or it should be put in maybe in the 4th category? So what do you think? So like a 4th type of tropes.
Yeah, in fact, so in at least so the view of my book Abstract Objects and the Semantics of Natural Language, there I have the view that wisdom is nothing but a kind referring term with referring to a kind whose instances are tropes. And as a kind referring term, it is in fact nothing but a modalized plural term referring to the plurality of all actual and possible tropes. So and so you really have a reduction of reference to universals to generic sentences. So I do make use of merely possible tropes. Otherwise, you have a problem with identifying redness from crimson. So redness is a different kind from crimson. But if like you were to identify universals as sets of tropes, then if in the actual world, the set of crimson things is identical to the set of red things, you would not be able to distinguish redness from crimson. So I make use of modalized pluralities in order to account for kinds of tropes, and I have the view that wisdom is a kind referring term of the very same sort as giraffes or water, which are more familiar kind referring terms. And so we just have genericity in some sense, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I got it. So any questions? Well, there's no question, so I will continue with mine. Another question I have is a question about part 2.1, about the necessary relation between a trope and its bearer. So I wanted to ask you about well, the recent tradition, as you said, of viewing individuals just as a bundle of tropes. And if we say that trope is always the trope always needs a bearer and it's ontologically dependent on a bearer, but if we consider individuals to be a trope bundle of tropes, yeah, so it's just not a particular category of, well, things in the world, entities in the world, but just a bundle of tropes, how can we say in this case that trope depends on the bearer in the ontological sense if we don't have any bearers according to these traditions, because the only thing we have is just a bundle of tropes? I just cannot, well,
Yeah.
my mind about this idea. So can you, well, a little bit explain it?
Yeah, you are totally correct. So the ontological dependence, that is a condition that obtains for tropes within this Aristotelian tradition, the older tradition on which tropes are a category beside individuals or substances. So on the, in fact, on Aristotle's view, tropes or accidents are ontologically dependent on a bearer. And the recent tradition of tropes that was initiated by Williams, the notion of ontological dependence makes no sense. You just construe individuals. Well, you could say individuals then are ontologically dependent on tropes, given that they are nothing but bundles of tropes. Yeah. So I should have clarified that that pertains to the older tradition, which I myself adopt. So I'm not a trope reductionist, one category ontologist, but rather I situate myself within the older Aristotelian tradition.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, so now it makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So, dear colleagues and friends, do you have any questions for Friederike? Well, yeah, it looks like no questions. Well, of course, I have more questions, but since I think we are slightly running out of time, yeah, and we need to move to another talk, yeah, so maybe I will ask you my questions here later. Yeah, so thank you.
Quickly, and I can respond also by email.
Yeah. Okay, so thanks again very much, Friederike. So I'm very happy again, and I'm very honored to have you with us. So thank you very much for your talk.